On a cold April morning, a submarine slipped beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean and vanished. 129 men were aboard. Not a single one came back. The water that swallowed them was not particularly deep by ocean standards. It was not at the bottom of some unreachable trench. It was roughly 1,300 feet down, a depth that modern recreational submersibles can reach without extraordinary effort. But in 1963, the technology aboard that vessel was supposed to represent the absolute pinnacle of American naval engineering. It was the most advanced nuclear-powered submarine ever built. It had been designed to dive deeper, move faster, and operate more quietly than anything else in the water. The United States Navy believed it was untouchable. They were wrong. The name of that submarine was the USS Thresher, hull number SSN 593. She was the lead ship of her class, the first of a new breed of hunter-killer submarines designed to track and destroy Soviet ballistic missile boats during the most dangerous years of the Cold War. Everything about her was classified. Her exact depth limits, her sonar capabilities, her weapons systems, her nuclear reactor specifications. She carried secrets that were only considered vital to the survival of the fleet. On the 10th of April 1963, she carried all of those secrets and all of those men straight to the bottom of the sea. What happened in the final minutes of the Thresher's life remains one of the most chilling sequences of events in naval history. The men aboard knew something was going on. They communicated fragments of information to a surface ship that was accompanying them. Those fragments were garbled, desperate, and then there was silence. Not the silence of a radio turning off. The silence of absolute destruction. The kind of silence that happens when a steel hull, pressurized to keep human beings alive in a hostile environment, fails catastrophically and implodes under millions of pounds of force. The entire event, from the first sign of trouble to total annihilation, likely took less than 1/10 of a second. The crew would not have had time to understand what was happening. They would not have felt pain. The physics of implosion at that depth moves faster than the human nervous system can process sensation. One moment they existed. The next, they did not. That is not a comfortable thought. It is not meant to be. Because the story of the Thresher is not simply a story about a submarine that sank. It is a story about arrogance and assumption. It is a story about what happens when human beings place absolute faith in their own engineering and discover, in the most brutal way possible, that the ocean does not care about engineering. The ocean does not negotiate. The ocean does not forgive mistakes. It simply applies pressure, patient and indifferent, and waits for the weakest point to give way. The loss of the Thresher was the worst submarine disaster in United States Navy history at that time. It prompted the largest investigation the Navy had ever conducted into a peacetime loss. It fundamentally changed the way submarines were designed, built, tested, and maintained. It rewrote safety protocols that are still in effect today, and yet, for all the lessons it taught, the most haunting aspect of the Thresher story is how preventable it was. The failures that killed those 129 men were not exotic or mysterious. They were mundane, ordinary. The kinds of failures that happen when schedules are rushed, when inspections are skipped, when small problems are noted in reports, but never addressed because there's always pressure to get the boat back in the water. Always pressure to meet deadlines. Always pressure, pressure. That word will follow us through this entire journey, because pressure is what the ocean is made of, and pressure is what the Navy was under, and pressure is what ultimately killed the men aboard the Thresher. The pressure of the deep Atlantic, squeezing every square inch of that hull with a force that no human structure can withstand indefinitely, and the pressure of the Cold War, squeezing every decision, every shortcut, every compromise into a framework where speed mattered more than safety, where getting the submarine operational mattered more than getting it right. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand what really happened to the USS Thresher. Not just the mechanical failure, not just the chain of events, but the deeper truth about what it means to send human beings into an environment that is fundamentally hostile to their existence, enclosed in a steel tube, surrounded by water so heavy it could crush a building, relying entirely on the integrity of welded joints and brazed pipe fittings and valves that were inspected by men who were tired, rushed, and under orders to finish on schedule. You are going to understand why 129 men died in an instant, and why the ocean, even now more than 60 years later, still holds their remains in a field of debris scattered across the seafloor, 8,400 feet below the surface, in water so cold and so dark that nothing there will ever change. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. The Atlantic Ocean kept the Thresher's story quiet for decades. The full details of the investigation were classified for years. Some aspects remain disputed to this day. But the ocean floor does not lie. The wreckage speaks for itself. And the silence of 129 men, who never had the chance to say goodbye, speaks loudest of all. Now let's begin. To understand what happened to the Thresher, it is first necessary to understand where it happened. Not the coordinates on a chart, though those matter. What matters more is the nature of the environment itself. The ocean is not simply water. It is a world governed by forces that operate on a scale most people never consider. Forces so immense and so relentless that they reshape everything they touch, including steel, including bone, including the boundary between life and death. The Atlantic Ocean covers an area of roughly 41 million square miles. It is the second largest ocean on the planet, stretching from the Arctic in the north to the Antarctic in the south, separating the Americas from Europe and Africa. Its average depth is approximately 10,700 feet, more than 2 miles of water stacked on top of itself. In some places, particularly along the mid-Atlantic ridge, the floor rises toward the surface in great volcanic mountains. In other places, it plunges into abyssal plains that stretch for hundreds of miles in total flatness, carpeted in fine sediment that has been settling, particle by particle, for longer than human civilization has existed. The Thresher was lost in the western Atlantic, roughly 220 miles east of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, in an area where the continental shelf drops away into deep water. The depth at the lost site is approximately 8,400 feet. That number requires context. If you took the Empire State Building, which stands roughly 1,450 feet tall, and stacked nearly 6 of them on top of each other, the topmost antenna would barely break the surface at the point where the Thresher's wreckage lies. If you took Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on land at 29,032 feet, and submerged it in the deepest part of the Atlantic, the Puerto Rico Trench at 28,232 feet, the summit would still be above water, but only barely. The ocean is not just deep, it is deep on a scale that defies casual comprehension. But depth alone is not the danger. The danger is pressure. Water is heavy. A single cubic foot of seawater weighs approximately 64 pounds. That does not sound like much until you begin to multiply. At the surface, the atmosphere presses down on every square inch of your body with a force of about 14.7 pounds per square inch, a unit known as 1 atmosphere. For every 33 feet you descend in seawater, the pressure increases by 1 additional atmosphere. At 100 feet, the pressure is roughly 4 atmospheres. At 330 feet, it is 11 atmospheres. At 1,000 feet, it is approximately 31 atmospheres, meaning every square inch of surface is bearing 455 pounds of force. Now consider the Thresher's test depth. The exact figure was classified, but it is generally understood to have been around 1,300 feet. At that depth, the pressure on the hull was approximately 40 atmospheres, or roughly 588 pounds per square inch. Every square inch. The entire surface of that submarine, every weld, every hatch, every pipe penetration, every valve fitting, was bearing that load continuously. The hull of the Thresher was constructed from a special high-yield steel called HY80, named for its ability to withstand 80,000 pounds per square inch of yield stress. This was an advanced material for its time, significantly stronger than the steel used in earlier submarine classes. But even HY80 has limits, and the ocean's pressure has none. The concept of crush depth is central to submarine operations. Every submarine has a rated test depth, which is the maximum depth at which the Navy certifies the hull can operate safely. Below that is an estimated crush depth, typically calculated at some percentage beyond test depth, at which the hull is expected to fail catastrophically. The margin between test depth and crush depth is not large. It might be a few hundred feet. In the case of the Thresher, the submarine sank well past both numbers. The wreckage sits at 8,400 feet, a depth where the pressure exceeds 3,700 pounds per square inch. At that pressure, the hull did not simply crack or leak. It imploded. The steel walls collapsed inward at velocities approaching the speed of sound in water, approximately 5,000 feet per second. The implosion generated a shock wave that was detected on underwater listening devices hundreds of miles away. The entire submarine was reduced to fragments in a fraction of a second. To grasp what implosion means at these pressures, consider a simple analogy. Imagine placing an empty aluminum can on the ground and then stacking automobiles on top of it. Not one automobile, not 10. Imagine stacking roughly 260 automobiles, each weighing 4,000 pounds, on top of that single can, concentrating all that weight onto its walls. The can would be obliterated instantly. Now imagine that the can is 312 feet long and 31 feet wide, made of high-strength steel, and filled with nuclear reactor components, torpedo tubes, electronic equipment, and 129 human beings. The physics does not change. The ocean does not distinguish between an aluminum can and a submarine. It applies force uniformly, without preference, without mercy. Light is another factor that defines the ocean's hostility. Sunlight, the energy source that sustains nearly all life on the surface of the planet, penetrates seawater to a limited degree. The uppermost layer of the ocean, from the surface down to roughly 660 feet, is called the epipelagic zone, or the sunlight zone. This is where photosynthesis occurs, where phytoplankton bloom, where the familiar creatures of the sea, dolphins, tuna, sea turtles, sharks, spend most of their lives. It is the ocean that most people imagine when they think of the ocean, warm, bright, alive. Below the epipelagic zone lies the mesopelagic zone, the twilight zone, extending from roughly 660 feet down to 3,300 feet. Here, sunlight fades to a dim blue glow, barely perceptible, insufficient for photosynthesis, but enough for some organisms to detect with specialized eyes. This is the realm of lanternfish, hatchetfish, and the countless small creatures that migrate vertically each night, rising toward the surface to feed in the darkness and descending again at dawn to hide in the gloom. The Thresher's test depth placed it in this zone. At 1,300 feet, there would have been a faint trace of light, the last whisper of the sun before it surrenders entirely to the dark. Below the mesopelagic zone is the bathypelagic zone, the midnight zone, from 3,300 feet to 13,100 feet. Here, sunlight does not exist. Not a trace, not a photon. The darkness is absolute, total, and permanent. It is a darkness that has no parallel on the surface of the Earth. Even the darkest cave, the deepest mine shaft, the most remote desert on a moonless night has some residual glow from the atmosphere, from starlight, from distant human activity. At 4,000 feet beneath the Atlantic, there is nothing. A human being floating in that water without artificial light would see nothing at all. The eyes would strain, the pupils would dilate to their maximum, and still there would be nothing. Just blackness, pressing in from every direction, as heavy and as real as the water itself. The Thresher's wreckage lies in this zone. 8,400 feet down, in perpetual night, in near-freezing water, under pressure that would crush any unprotected object. The temperature at that depth in the western Atlantic is approximately 2 degrees Celsius, roughly 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold enough that biological decomposition proceeds at a fraction of its normal rate. Cold enough that the remains of the submarine have changed very little in the decades since the sinking. The ocean preserves what it takes. It holds it in cold storage, in the dark, indefinitely. Understanding these zones matters because they define the boundaries of human capability. Human beings evolved to live at the surface, in the sunlight zone. Everything below that is hostile territory. We can survive brief dives to the mesopelagic zone with proper equipment. We can reach the bathypelagic zone only inside heavily engineered pressure vessels, submarines, or deep-diving submersibles built to withstand forces that would kill an unprotected person instantly. Below the bathypelagic zone lies the abyssopelagic zone, from 13,100 feet to roughly 19,700 feet, and below that, in the deepest ocean trenches, lies the hadalpelagic zone, named after Hades, the ancient Greek god of the underworld. These are places where almost no human being has ever been, places where the pressure exceeds 16,000 pounds per square inch, places where the weight of the water overhead is so immense that it alters the fundamental chemistry of the environment. The Thresher was not operating at those extreme depths. It did not need to. The ocean killed it at a depth that is, in the grand scheme of oceanic scale, relatively shallow. 1,300 feet is barely scratching the surface of the deep ocean. It is not even close to the abyssal plains, let alone the trenches. And that is part of what makes the Thresher story so disturbing. The submarine was not venturing into the unknown. It was operating within its designed parameters, conducting a routine test dive in waters that were well charted, well understood, and considered entirely manageable for a vessel of its class. The ocean did not need to deploy its full arsenal of pressure and darkness to destroy the Thresher. It only needed to find one weakness, one flaw, one point of failure. The history of submarine operations is in many ways a history of that search. The ocean probes every hull, every seal, every joint, every moment of every dive. It finds the weak points with the patience of geology and the force of physics. Submarines are engineering marvels, but they are also compromises, structures built to withstand enormous forces while remaining light enough to move through the water and large enough to carry crew, weapons, reactors, and equipment. Every design decision involves a trade-off between strength and weight, between safety margins and operational capability. The Thresher was built during a period when those trade-offs were being pushed harder than ever before, driven by the demands of a geopolitical conflict that left little room for caution. The Cold War, the decades-long standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, was the context in which the Thresher was conceived, designed, built, and lost. By the late 1950s, both superpowers had developed nuclear-powered submarines capable of carrying ballistic missiles. These missile submarines, known as SSBNs, were considered the ultimate deterrent, virtually undetectable weapons platforms that could launch nuclear strikes from beneath the ocean's surface. The Navy's response was to develop a new class of fast attack submarines, SSNs, specifically designed to hunt and kill enemy missile boats. The Thresher was the first of this new class. She was the tip of the spear, the prototype for a generation of submarines that would form the backbone of American undersea warfare for decades. She was built at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery, Maine. Her keel was laid on the 28th of May, 1958. She was launched on the 9th of July, 1960, and commissioned on the 3rd of August, 1961. Her construction incorporated numerous innovations. Her hull was designed with a new teardrop shape, optimized for submerged speed rather than surface performance. Her sonar systems were the most advanced in the fleet, housed in a large bow-mounted dome that gave her exceptional detection range. Her propulsion system was a Westinghouse S5W pressurized water reactor driving 2 steam turbines connected to a single propeller shaft. She could make speeds in excess of 30 knots submerged. She was quieter than her predecessors. She was deeper diving. She was, by every metric the Navy cared about, a masterpiece, but she was also rushed. The pressure to get the Thresher operational, to begin producing submarines of her class and deploying them against the Soviet threat, meant that certain compromises were made during construction. Inspections were sometimes cursory. Quality control standards were not always enforced. Pipe joints were brazed using a silver brazing technique that was known to be problematic. Brazed joints, unlike welded joints, rely on a filler metal with a lower melting point to bond 2 pieces of pipe together. When done correctly, the joint is strong and reliable. When done incorrectly, or when the joint is subjected to stresses beyond its design limits, it can fail. And, in a submarine, a failed pipe joint means water intrusion. Water intrusion at depth means flooding. Flooding means loss of buoyancy. Loss of buoyancy means sinking. And sinking, past a certain point, means death. The Navy knew about the brazing problems. Reports had been filed. Inspections had found deficiencies. Some joints had been repaired, many had not. The scale of the problem was enormous. The Thresher had thousands of pipe joints throughout her systems, carrying everything from seawater for cooling to hydraulic fluid for operating equipment. Each joint was a potential point of failure. Each point of failure was a potential pathway for the ocean to enter the submarine. And once the ocean begins to enter a submarine at depth, the sequence of events that follows is almost impossible to reverse. This was the machine that slipped beneath the waves on the morning of April 10th, 1963. This was the engineering that 129 men trusted with their lives. A marvel of Cold War technology, built in haste, maintained under pressure, carrying known deficiencies that had been documented but not corrected. She was accompanied by the submarine rescue ship USS Skylark, which maintained a surface position above the Thresher's diving area. The Skylark was equipped with underwater communications equipment that would allow her to stay in contact with the Thresher during the test dive. That communication link, fragile and unreliable, would become the only thread connecting the crew of the Thresher to the world above as their submarine descended into the dark Atlantic water. What followed was a sequence of events that lasted less than 15 minutes. In those minutes, a series of small failures cascaded into a catastrophe that was total and irreversible. The ocean found its weakness. The pressure did the rest. And the silence that followed has lasted for more than 6 decades. But to understand those 15 minutes, we need to look much more closely at what went wrong, at who made the decisions that led to that morning, and at why a submarine that was supposed to be the best in the world became instead a tomb. The morning of April 10th, 1963, began without alarm. The weather over the Western Atlantic was cold but manageable. The USS Thresher, having completed a 9-month overhaul at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, was ready for her post-overhaul sea trials. These trials were standard procedure. After any extended period of maintenance, a submarine must demonstrate that all of its systems function correctly at depth before it can be returned to active service. The Thresher needed to prove that her hull was sound, her reactor was stable, her propulsion was reliable, and her depth control systems were operating within specifications. She needed to dive to her test depth and come back up. The commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander John Wesley Harvey, a seasoned submarine officer who had taken command of the Thresher in January of 1962. Harvey was respected by his crew. He was known as a careful, methodical officer who did not take unnecessary risks. On this particular morning, he had aboard not only his regular crew, but also a number of additional personnel. There were civilian engineers and technicians from the shipyard and from various defense contractors who were aboard to observe the performance of systems they had worked on during the overhaul. There were also officers from the Naval Ordnance Laboratory. In total, 129 souls were aboard the Thresher as she departed Portsmouth and headed for her designated diving area, a section of the Atlantic roughly 220 miles east of Cape Cod. The submarine rescue ship USS Skylark, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Stanley Hecker, was already on station in the diving area. The Skylark's role was to maintain communications with the Thresher and to be available in the event of an emergency, though the reality was that the Skylark had no capability to rescue a submarine in distress at depth. There was no technology in 1963 that could reach a disabled submarine at 1,300 feet. The Skylark was there as a communication relay and a surface reference point, nothing more. If something went seriously wrong at depth, the Thresher would have to save herself. The Thresher arrived on station and began preparations for the dive. Communications between the two vessels were conducted using the UQC, an underwater telephone system that transmitted voice signals through the water. The UQC was notoriously unreliable. Sound travels well through water, but voice intelligibility degrades rapidly with distance, depth, and ocean conditions. Messages were often garbled, fragmented, or lost entirely. This would become critically important in the hours that followed. At approximately 7:47 in the morning, the Thresher began her descent. The dive was planned as a series of steps. The submarine would descend to a specific depth, Level off, check all systems, report to the Skylark, and then continue deeper. This step-by-step approach was standard practice for post-overhaul dives. It allowed the crew to identify problems early, before the submarine reached depths where those problems could become fatal. The early stages of the dive proceeded normally. The Thresher descended through the first several hundred feet without incident. Communications with the Skylark were maintained, though the quality of the UQC transmissions was poor from the beginning. Messages had to be repeated. Some were unintelligible. The crews on both vessels were accustomed to this. It was a known limitation of the technology. As the Thresher descended past 900 feet, she was approaching the boundary of her operating envelope. Every additional foot of depth increased the pressure on her hull and on every system within it. The seawater pipes that ran through the submarine, carrying cooling water for the reactor and other systems, were under increasing stress. The brazed joints in those pipes, some of which had been reworked during the overhaul and some of which had not, were bearing loads that tested their integrity. At approximately 9:17 in the morning, something changed. The Skylark received a transmission from the Thresher that was partially garbled but appeared to include the words, "experiencing minor difficulty." The exact wording has been debated for decades. The UQC transmission was so distorted that different listeners interpreted it differently. Some heard minor difficulty, others heard minor problem. The precise phrasing matters less than the fact that the Thresher was reporting trouble. A submarine at depth does not use the word difficulty casually. Even a minor problem at 900 feet or deeper demands immediate attention. What happened next has been reconstructed from the fragmentary communications received by the Skylark, from the acoustic data recorded by unlocked listening stations, and from the forensic analysis of the wreckage recovered from the ocean floor. The reconstruction is not complete. There are gaps that will never be filled, questions that will never be answered with certainty. But the broad sequence of events is understood well enough to paint a picture of cascading failure that is both terrifying in its speed and heartbreaking in its inevitability. The most widely accepted theory, supported by the findings of the Navy's Court of Inquiry convened in 1963 and by subsequent analyses, is that the Thresher experienced a failure in one of her seawater piping systems. A brazed joint, weakened by poor workmanship during the original construction or during the overhaul, gave way under the pressure at depth. Seawater began flooding into the engine room at tremendous force. The spray from a ruptured pipe at that depth would have been a high-velocity jet of water, cold and powerful enough to knock a man off his feet, powerful enough to short out electrical equipment, powerful enough to create a fog of atomized water that would have reduced visibility to near zero within seconds. The flooding triggered automatic safety systems. The reactor, detecting conditions that could compromise its operation, scrammed, meaning it automatically shut down by inserting control rods into the reactor core to halt the nuclear chain reaction. A scram is a safety measure designed to prevent a reactor meltdown or a radiation release. It works exactly as intended, but it has a devastating side effect in a submarine that is flooding at depth. When the reactor shuts down, the submarine loses its primary source of propulsion power. The steam turbines that drive the propeller stop. The submarine can no longer drive itself upward through the water column. It begins to sink. In theory, the Thresher had backup systems to address this situation. She could blow her main ballast tanks, forcing high-pressure air into the tanks to expel seawater and increase buoyancy. This is the standard emergency procedure for a submarine that has lost propulsion at depth. Blow the tanks, gain positive buoyancy, rise to the surface. It is a procedure practiced in drills. It is a procedure that every submarine crew trains for. It is a procedure that should have worked, but here's the problem. The high-pressure air system that was supposed to blow the ballast tanks may not have functioned properly. There is strong evidence, supported by testing, conducted after the disaster, that moisture in the high-pressure air lines froze as the air expanded rapidly through the valves. When compressed air expands, it cools dramatically, a phenomenon known as the Joule-Thomson effect. If there is any moisture in the air lines, that moisture can freeze into ice crystals that block the flow of air through the system strainers, small mesh screens designed to prevent debris from entering the valves. The strainers clog. The airflow slows to a trickle. The ballast tanks do not blow. The submarine does not rise. This was not a theoretical concern. The Navy had known about the potential for moisture-induced icing in high-pressure air systems. Tests conducted after the Thresher's loss demonstrated that under conditions replicating those aboard the submarine, the airflow through the emergency blow system could be reduced by as much as 85%. 85%. The system that was supposed to save the crew in an emergency could deliver only 15% of its rated airflow. That is not enough to blow the tanks. That is not enough to stop the descent. That is not enough to save anyone, and it gets worse. The Thresher was not just sinking. She was sinking into water that got progressively more lethal with every foot of descent. As she passed through her test depth, the pressure on the hull exceeded the design limits of the HY-80 steel. The hull groaned. Metal stressed beyond its yield point deforms. It does not snap back. It bends, it stretches, it develops microscopic cracks that propagate through the steel at frightening speed. The flooding that had started as a single pipe failure may have been joined by hull leaks as the structure began to lose its integrity. The crew was fighting multiple emergencies simultaneously, in the dark, in the cold, in a submarine that was sinking out of control. The communications received by the Skylark during these final minutes were agonizing in their fragmentation. At approximately 9:18, the Skylark received a transmission that included what sounded like the words "test depth." Some analysts believe the full message was an attempt to report that the submarine had exceeded test depth. Others believe it was a request for clarification of their current depth. The UQC distortion makes certainty impossible. What is certain is that the tone of the communications had changed. The measured professionalism of routine reporting had been replaced by something urgent, something strained. The final intelligible communication from the Thresher came at approximately 9:13. The Skylark personnel reported hearing a broken transmission that included the phrase 900 north. This has been interpreted as a possible attempt to communicate a heading, a course the submarine was attempting to follow. Other analysts have suggested it might have been a depth reading, garbled beyond recognition. Whatever it was the last thing the surface world ever heard from the Thresher. What followed was a sound that no one aboard the Skylark could misinterpret. At 9:18, the Skylark's sonar operators detected a series of sounds that were consistent with a submarine hull imploding. The sounds were sharp, percussive, and final. They were the sounds of high-strength steel collapsing inward under pressure that exceeded its ultimate strength. The sounds continued for several seconds, a series of implosions as different compartments of the submarine failed in rapid succession. Air pockets within the hull compressed to nothing. Equipment was crushed, bulkheads folded, and then silence. The entire sequence, from the first report of difficulty to the final implosion, lasted approximately 5 minutes. Some estimates place it at slightly less, some at slightly more. In those minutes, 129 men experienced the most terrifying scenario a submariner can face. They knew they were flooding. They knew they were losing power. They knew they were sinking. They knew, with a cold, mathematical certainty that submarine training provides, exactly what would happen if they could not stop the descent. They fought. They followed their training. They attempted every procedure available to them. And the ocean took them anyway. The implosion itself was mercifully fast. When the hull failed, the collapse would have occurred at a speed that exceeded the human body's ability to perceive it. The time between the first structural failure and total destruction of the pressure hull was estimated at approximately 1/15 of a second. In that instant, the atmospheric pressure inside the submarine, approximately 1 atmosphere, would have been subjected to the external pressure of approximately 600 pounds per square inch. The air inside the hull would have compressed so rapidly that it would have heated to temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, a phenomenon known as adiabatic heating. Everything inside the submarine, equipment, furnishings, the bodies of the crew, would have been subjected to this thermal pulse simultaneously with the mechanical forces of the collapsing hull. There would have been no pain. There would have been no awareness. The destruction was absolute and instantaneous. The Skylark attempted repeatedly to re-establish communication with the Thresher. The calls went unanswered. Lieutenant Commander Hecker, aboard the Skylark, followed protocol, continuing to call, waiting for a response, hoping against the evidence of his own sonar recordings that the Thresher might surface. She did not surface. She would never surface. The search operation that followed was massive. The Navy dispatched ships, aircraft, and deep-diving equipment to the area. The Bathscaphe Trieste, famous for its record-setting dive to the bottom of the Mariana Trench in 1960, with Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh aboard, was brought to the search area. The Trieste made multiple dives to the ocean floor in the weeks and months following the loss, locating and photographing the wreckage of the Thresher. What it found was devastating. The submarine had been torn apart. The wreckage field covered an area of roughly 160,000 square yards on the ocean floor. Pieces of the hull, equipment, personal effects, and unidentifiable fragments were scattered across the abyssal plain like the contents of a shattered jar. The largest intact section of the submarine was less than 30 feet long. Everything else had been reduced to debris. The photographs taken by the Trieste are among the most sobering images in naval history. They show twisted metal, ruptured pipes, shattered instruments, and the mundane objects of daily life aboard a submarine: shoes, coffee cups, tools, spread across the dark sediment of the ocean floor. They are images of total destruction, made all the more haunting by the absolute stillness of the deep ocean environment. Nothing moves at 8,400 feet. The water is motionless. The sediment settles and stays. The wreckage lies exactly where it fell, undisturbed, unrecovered, a permanent memorial to the men who died inside it. The Navy convened a court of inquiry that heard testimony from hundreds of witnesses, reviewed thousands of documents, and examined all available physical evidence. The proceedings were largely classified, though significant portions have since been declassified. The court concluded that the most probable cause of the Thresher's loss was a piping system failure in the engine room, leading to flooding, reactor shutdown, and the inability to recover from the resulting loss of propulsion and buoyancy. The court identified deficiencies in the quality assurance processes used during the submarine's construction and overhaul, particularly in the inspection and testing of brazed pipe joints. It noted that the silver brazing technique used in the Thresher's piping was prone to producing joints that appeared sound on external inspection, but contained internal voids, cracks, and other defects that could lead to failure under stress. The numbers revealed during the investigation were staggering. Of approximately 3,000 pipe joints inspected using improved ultrasonic testing methods after the Thresher's loss, roughly 14% were found to be defective. 14%. 1 in 7 joints in the piping system of a nuclear submarine was flawed. On other submarines of the same class that were inspected following the disaster, the numbers were similarly alarming. These were not isolated defects. They were systemic failures of quality control embedded in the construction process, present in submarines that were already in active service, carrying crews that had no idea they were operating vessels with hundreds of defective pipe joints in their hulls. Something was wrong with the Navy's assumptions about submarine construction quality. The system that was supposed to ensure that every joint, every weld, every component met exacting standards had failed silently and comprehensively. The inspectors were not catching the defects. The testing methods were inadequate. The production schedules left no time for the kind of careful, methodical quality assurance that submarine construction demands. The Navy had built an extraordinary machine and then undermined it with ordinary negligence. Lieutenant Commander Harvey and his crew were not victims of a single dramatic failure. They were victims of 1,000 small failures, each one individually insignificant, each one overlooked or accepted or deferred in the name of meeting the schedule, getting the boat back in the water, staying ahead of the Soviets. The pipe joint that failed was one of thousands. The frozen air strainer that prevented the emergency blow was a known vulnerability that had not been addressed. The reactor scram that killed propulsion was a safety feature that worked exactly as designed, but left the submarine powerless at the worst possible moment. Each failure depended on the others. Each failure amplified the others, and together they were lethal. This is the anatomy of a disaster, not a single catastrophic event, but a cascade of minor deficiencies, each one tolerable in isolation, each one fatal in combination. It is a pattern that appears again and again in the history of engineering failures, from bridge collapses to aircraft crashes to industrial explosions. It is the pattern that safety engineers call the Swiss cheese model, where multiple layers of defense each have holes, and disaster occurs when the holes align. On the morning of April 10th, 1963, all the holes aligned, and the ocean poured through. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The loss of the USS Thresher did not happen in isolation. It happened within a broader context of deep-sea operations, submarine disasters, and humanity's ongoing, often futile attempts to master an environment that remains fundamentally beyond our control. To understand the full weight of what happened to the Thresher, and why it continues to matter more than 6 decades later, we need to examine not just the submarine itself, but the wider landscape of deep ocean mysteries, failures, and discoveries that frame this story. Because the Thresher is not merely a naval tragedy, it is a window into the ocean's indifference, a reminder that the deep sea operates by rules that human engineering can bend but never break. The first angle to consider is the nature of hydrothermal vents and the life that thrives around them, because they reveal something fundamental about the ocean that the Thresher disaster underscores. In 1977, scientists aboard the submersible Alvin, diving near the Galapagos Rift in the eastern Pacific, discovered hydrothermal vents, cracks in the ocean floor where superheated water, loaded with dissolved minerals and chemicals, erupts from the Earth's interior into the frigid deep sea. The water emerging from these vents can reach temperatures exceeding 700 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet it does not boil because the enormous pressure at those depths raises the boiling point far above what we experience at the surface. Around these vents, in water that should be lifeless, the scientists found thriving ecosystems, tube worms, several feet long, giant clams, swarms of shrimp, and dense mats of bacteria. These organisms do not depend on sunlight. They derive their energy from the chemical reactions between the vent fluids and the seawater, a process called chemosynthesis. The relevance of hydrothermal vents to the Thresher story is not biological, it is philosophical. The existence of life at hydrothermal vents demonstrated that the deep ocean is not a barren wasteland. It is an active, dynamic, chemically complex environment that operates according to principles that surface-dwelling humans barely understand. The same forces that create hydrothermal vents, the immense pressures, the tectonic activity, the chemical complexity of deep seawater, are the forces that destroyed the Thresher. The ocean floor is not passive, it is not empty. It is a place where geological, chemical, and physical processes operate on scales and at intensities that make human engineering seem fragile by comparison. The men of the Thresher entered an environment that was not just hostile, but actively, energetically, overwhelmingly powerful in ways they could not fully appreciate from the surface. But the discovery of hydrothermal vents also highlights a limitation that connects directly to the Thresher: investigation. When the Navy needed to find and examine the Thresher's wreckage, it had to use the most advanced deep-sea technology available, the bathyscaphe Trieste. The Trieste was a remarkable vessel, the only crewed vehicle at that time capable of reaching the abyssal depths where the Thresher lay. But the Trieste was slow, cumbersome, and extremely limited in its ability to survey large areas of ocean floor. Each dive took hours. The field of view from the small observation windows was tiny. The currents at depth made precise navigation difficult. Locating specific pieces of wreckage in a debris field covering 160,000 square yards of featureless sediment was like searching for individual grains of colored sand in a darkened football field, using nothing but a flashlight with a beam the width of a pencil. The technology has improved since then. Remotely operated vehicles, autonomous underwater vehicles, high-resolution sonar mapping systems, and advanced imaging technologies have transformed deep-sea exploration. But even today, the deep ocean remains the most inaccessible environment on Earth. More people have stood on the surface of the Moon than have visited the bottom of the Mariana Trench. The technology required to operate at those depths, to withstand the pressure, to maintain power and communications, To see and record in absolute darkness pushes the limits of engineering as surely as it did in 1963. The ocean has not become more forgiving. We have simply become slightly better at surviving its indifference. The second angle worth examining is the phenomenon of brine pools, one of the deep ocean's most alien features, because they illustrate the ocean's capacity to create environments so extreme that they are lethal even to deep-sea organisms adapted to conditions that would kill any surface creature. A brine pool is a body of water on the ocean floor that is so saturated with dissolved salt that it is significantly denser than the surrounding seawater. These pools are found at the bases of continental slopes and near underwater salt deposits. They are clearly visible from submersibles as distinct bodies of liquid, with shorelines and surfaces sitting on the ocean floor like lakes on land. The analogy is not casual. They are literally lakes within the ocean. The water in these pools can be 3 to 5 times saltier than normal seawater. The boundary between the brine and the surrounding ocean, called halakline, is so sharp that it is visible to the naked eye, a shimmering interface where two bodies of water with different densities refuse to mix. The brine is often laced with toxic concentrations of methane and hydrogen sulfide. Any fish, shrimp, or crab that swims into a brine pool is typically killed within seconds, pickled by the extreme salinity and poisoned by the dissolved gases. The edges of brine pools are often littered with the preserved carcasses of creatures that wandered too close. The connection to the Thresher is not about brine pools themselves, but about what they represent. The deep ocean contains environments within environments, pockets of conditions so extreme that they defy the expectations of scientists who have studied the sea for centuries. The Navy in 1963 understood the ocean in terms of depth, pressure, and temperature. Those were the variables they engineered against. But the ocean is far more complex than a simple equation of depth times pressure. It contains chemical gradients, thermal anomalies, current systems, geological features, and biological communities that interact in ways that are still being discovered. Every new deep-sea expedition reveals something unexpected. Every new discovery reinforces the same lesson. The ocean is not what we think it is. It is stranger, more dangerous, and more indifferent than our models predict. The numbers are striking when you examine the gap between what the Navy knew and what the ocean actually presented. Consider the simple matter of corrosion. Seawater is one of the most corrosive environments on Earth. It attacks steel, aluminum, copper, and virtually every metal used in submarine construction. The rate of corrosion depends on temperature, salinity, oxygen content, biological activity, and a host of other factors that vary from location to location and depth to depth. The Navy applied anti-corrosion coatings and used corrosion-resistant alloys wherever possible. But the reality is that a submarine operating in seawater is in a constant state of chemical attack. Every surface, every joint, every fitting is being slowly degraded by the water it operates in. The brazed joints that failed on the Thresher were not just vulnerable to mechanical stress, they were also vulnerable to corrosion, particularly at the interfaces between dissimilar metals, where galvanic corrosion can accelerate the degradation process dramatically. The third angle brings us to the Bermuda Triangle, not as a mystery in the supernatural sense, but as a region of ocean that has claimed an extraordinary number of ships and aircraft over the decades, and what that tells us about the relationship between human navigation and oceanic reality. The Thresher was lost in the western Atlantic, not far from the northern edge of what is popularly called the Bermuda Triangle. The Bermuda Triangle itself has been thoroughly debunked as a paranormal phenomenon. The rate of ship and aircraft losses in that region is not statistically higher than in any other comparable area of ocean with similar traffic density. But the region does present genuine navigational and environmental challenges: strong currents, sudden storms, complex seafloor topography, and deep water close to shore that have contributed to real losses throughout history. The USS Cyclops, a Navy cargo ship, disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle region in March of 1918 with 306 people aboard. No wreckage was ever found. No distress signal was received. The ship simply vanished. The loss of the Cyclops remains the single largest non-combat loss of life in United States Navy history. The parallels with the Thresher are uncomfortable. Both vessels were lost without clear warning. Both sank so rapidly and so completely that no survivors were recovered. Both left behind more questions than answers, and both remind us that the Atlantic Ocean, for all its familiarity, is capable of swallowing ships and crews whole, leaving nothing behind but silence and speculation. But the comparison also highlights a crucial difference. The Cyclops was lost in an era when deep ocean investigation was essentially impossible. The ship sank, presumably, into deep water, and the Navy had no means to find it, reach it, or examine it. The loss remained a mystery by default, because the technology to solve it did not exist. The Thresher, by contrast, was lost in an era when the Navy could, with extraordinary effort and expense, reach the wreckage. The Trieste's dives to the debris field, the recovery of fragments, the photographic documentation of the site, these were unprecedented achievements in deep ocean forensics. For the first time, the Navy could examine the remains of a lost submarine and draw conclusions about what had happened. The conclusions were not comforting. They revealed a systemic failure of quality control that implicated not just the Thresher, but the entire submarine construction program. The fourth angle involves the deep-sea creatures that defy the physics of their environment, organisms that exist at pressures, temperatures, and chemical conditions that were once thought to be incompatible with life. Consider the snailfish, a small, pale, gelatinous fish that has been recorded at depths exceeding 26,000 feet in the Mariana Trench. At that depth, the pressure is approximately 8 tons per square inch. The snailfish does not have a swim bladder, the gas-filled organ that most fish use to control their buoyancy, because at such pressures, any gas-filled cavity would be crushed flat. Instead, the snailfish's body is composed almost entirely of a watery, gelatinous tissue that is essentially incompressible. Its cells contain specialized proteins that maintain their structure under extreme pressure, proteins that would denature and cease to function at normal atmospheric pressure. The snailfish is built for the deep. It cannot survive at the surface any more than a human can survive at its depth. This is relevant because it illustrates a principle that the Thresher disaster tragically confirmed. Survival in the deep ocean requires adaptation at the most fundamental level. Organisms that thrive in the deep have evolved bodies, biochemistry, and behaviors that are specifically calibrated to the conditions of their environment. Human beings have done no such thing. We are surface creatures attempting to operate in an environment that is lethal to us in every conceivable way. Our submarines are artificial adaptations, engineering approximations of the biological adaptations that deep-sea organisms possess naturally, and like all approximations, they have limits. They have tolerances. They have points of failure. The snailfish does not have pipe joints that can fail. The snailfish does not have reactors that can scram. The snailfish does not need an emergency blow system. It is perfectly adapted to its environment. The Thresher was not. The fifth angle brings us to the Yonaguni Monument, a massive underwater rock formation off the coast of Yonaguni Island in Japan, discovered in 1986 by a diver named Kihachiro Aratake. The formation consists of flat terraces, sharp edges, right angles, and step-like structures that resemble, at first glance, a man-made pyramid or temple complex. It sits at a depth of roughly 80 feet, shallow enough for recreational divers to visit. The debate over whether the Yonaguni Monument is a natural geological formation or a man-made structure has continued for decades. Most geologists believe it is natural, formed by the fracturing of sandstone along pre-existing planes of weakness. Some researchers have argued that the regularity of its features suggests human modification. The relevance here is not the monument itself, but the broader question it raises about what lies beneath the ocean surface that we have not yet discovered. The Yonaguni Monument was found by accident by a single diver who happened to look in the right direction. It had been underwater, presumably for thousands of years, completely unknown. If a structure that large and that visually striking can remain hidden for millennia in only 80 feet of water, what might be hidden at 800 feet, or 8,000 feet, or 80,000 feet? The ocean conceals things. That is one of its most fundamental properties. It conceals geological features. It conceals biological communities. It conceals shipwrecks. It conceals evidence. And it concealed the truth about the Thresher for years, until technology advanced enough to pull fragments of that truth from the darkness. Each of these angles, hydrothermal vents, brine pools, the Bermuda Triangle's real dangers, deep-sea organisms, and hidden underwater structures, illuminates a different facet of the same fundamental reality. The ocean is not a passive body of water that humans traverse at will. It is an active, complex, and overwhelmingly powerful environment that operates independently of human intentions, human schedules, and human engineering. The men who designed the Thresher understood this in the abstract. They built a submarine with a thick steel hull, with backup systems, with emergency procedures. But they also built it with schedule pressure, with inadequate inspections, with known deficiencies that were documented and then shelved. They treated the ocean as a problem to be managed rather than a force to be respected. And the ocean, as it always does, found the gap between their confidence and their competence. The aftermath of the Thresher disaster brought about a profound change in the way the United States Navy approaches submarine safety. The program that emerged from the investigation was called SubSafe, an acronym for submarine safety. It was, and remains, one of the most rigorous quality assurance programs ever implemented by any military organization in the world. SubSafe imposed exacting standards on every aspect of submarine construction and maintenance that affected the pressure integrity of the hull and the ability of the submarine to recover from flooding. Every pipe joint, every hull weld, every valve, every fitting, every component that could, if it failed, allow seawater to enter the submarine or prevent the submarine from surfacing, was subjected to exhaustive inspection, testing, documentation, and traceability. Under SubSafe, every braze joint must be radiographically inspected, meaning X-rayed, to verify that the interior of the joint is free from voids, cracks, and other defects. Every weld must be performed by certified welders using approved procedures. Every piece of material used in the construction of a SubSafe certified system must be traceable to its source, with documentation that follows it from the mill to the submarine. If a single document is missing, the component cannot be installed. If a single test fails, the work must be redone. There are no waivers, there are no exceptions, there are no shortcuts. The cost of SubSafe has been enormous. It adds significant time and expense to every submarine construction and maintenance project. Shipyard workers sometimes spend more time documenting their work than performing it. The bureaucratic overhead is immense, but the results speak for themselves. Since the implementation of SubSafe in 1963, no SubSafe certified submarine has been lost due to a failure of hull integrity or seawater system failure. Not one. In more than 60 years of operation, through the construction and deployment of dozens of nuclear submarines, the SubSafe program has maintained a perfect record. It is a record built on the deaths of 129 men who demonstrated, in the most devastating way possible, what happens when quality is sacrificed for speed. But the Thresher was not the last submarine the Navy lost. In 1968, 5 years after the Thresher, the nuclear submarine USS Scorpion, SSN 589, was lost in the Atlantic with 99 men aboard. The Scorpion sank in approximately 10,000 feet of water southwest of the Azores. The cause of her loss has never been definitively determined. Unlike the Thresher, whose failure was attributed to a piping system deficiency, the Scorpion's loss has been attributed to various possible causes, including torpedo malfunction, battery explosion, or flooding from an unknown source. What is significant is that the Scorpion was not fully SubSafe certified at the time of her loss. She had been scheduled for a SubSafe overhaul that had been deferred. The systems that SubSafe was designed to protect may not have been fully compliant with the new standards when the submarine went down. The parallel between the Thresher and the Scorpion is poignant. Two nuclear submarines such a fire pass, 228 men dead. Two debris fields on the floor of the Atlantic, both too deep for recovery, both slowly being covered by the fine rain of sediment that falls continuously through the deep ocean. The Thresher proved that the old ways of building submarines were inadequate. The Scorpion suggested that even after the lesson was learned, implementation was not yet complete. The ocean did not wait for the Navy to finish implementing its safety program. It found another weakness and exploited it. The investigation into the Thresher also revealed something about the culture of submarine operations that extended far beyond contracts and ballast fittings. It revealed a culture of acceptance, of willingness to operate with known deficiencies. Because the mission demanded it, submarines returned from deployment with lists of discrepancies, items that needed repair or replacement. Those lists were prioritized. Some items were addressed immediately, others were deferred to the next maintenance period, and some were deferred again and again, accumulating in maintenance records like unpaid debts, each one individually manageable but collectively constituting a structural risk that no one was tracking. The Thresher went to sea with known deficiencies. She was not the only submarine to do so. She was simply the one where the accumulated risk became untenable at the worst possible moment. This pattern of deferred maintenance, of accepting known risks because the operational tempo demands it, is not unique to submarines. It appears in aviation, in infrastructure, in healthcare, in every field where complex systems are operated under pressure to perform. The Space Shuttle Challenger, lost in 1986, was destroyed by a failure of O-ring seals in the solid rocket boosters, a known vulnerability that had been documented, analyzed, and ultimately accepted as a manageable risk. The Deepwater Horizon oil rig, which exploded in 2010 and caused the largest marine oil spill in history, was operating with known concerns about the integrity of the well cementing. In each case, the pattern was the same. Known risks were assessed, accepted, and deferred until the moment they could no longer be deferred, and then people died. The Thresher was one of the earliest and most devastating examples of this pattern in the modern era of complex engineering systems. Her loss did not simply change submarine design. It changed the way engineers, managers, and military leaders think about risk. It demonstrated that in an environment as unforgiving as the deep ocean, there is no such thing as a tolerable deficiency. Every flaw is a potential failure point. Every failure point is a potential catastrophe, and every catastrophe is preventable, if the will exists to prevent it. The ocean does not grade on a curve. It does not offer partial credit for effort. It applies its forces uniformly, constantly, and without prejudice. A submarine that is 99% perfect is still vulnerable to the 1% that is not. The Thresher was, by the standards of her time, an exceptional submarine. She was the best of her class, and she was destroyed by deficiencies that represented a tiny fraction of her total engineering. But in the deep ocean, a tiny fraction is enough. A single failed joint, a single frozen strainer, a single reactor scram, each one a small event, together an annihilation. There is a number that defines our ignorance, and it is a large number. According to the estimates, most widely cited by oceanographic institutions, more than 95% of the world's ocean floor has never been explored. Not surveyed in detail, not mapped at high resolution, not visited by human eyes or robotic sensors. 95%. That means that for every mile of ocean floor that scientists have studied, there are roughly 19 miles that remain completely unknown. We have better maps of the surface of Mars than we do of the bottom of our own ocean. Let that sink in. The planet that we call home, the planet on which every human being who has ever lived has spent their entire existence, is covered in water to a degree that makes Earth a somewhat misleading name. The ocean covers approximately 71% of the planet's surface. It contains roughly 332 million cubic miles of water. It reaches depths of nearly 36,000 feet, and we have explored, in any meaningful sense, less than 5% of it. We live on a water world, and we barely know what is in the water. The Thresher was lost in a part of the ocean that is, by deep-sea standards, relatively well known. The Western Atlantic has been navigated for centuries. The shipping lanes between North America and Europe are among the most heavily travelled in the world. The continental shelf off the coast of New England has been fished, charted, and studied by generations of mariners and scientists. And yet, when the Thresher sank, finding her required months of searching with the most advanced technology available. The ocean floor at 8,400 feet was not well mapped. The wreckage was located primarily through acoustic analysis, comparing the sounds recorded by underwater listening stations with the known position of the Skylark at the time of the loss, and then confirming with visual surveys by the Trieste. The difficulty of finding a 312-foot submarine in a known area of the ocean underscores a larger truth. The ocean hides things. It hides them in darkness, in cold, under pressure, beneath sediment, in water that is opaque to the electromagnetic radiation, light and radio waves that we rely on for observation at the surface. The tools that work on land, satellites, cameras, radar, aircraft, do not work in the deep ocean. Satellite imagery cannot penetrate more than a few dozen feet of seawater. Radar is absorbed almost instantly by water. Even sonar, the primary tool for underwater observation, has significant limitations in range, resolution, and accuracy. Mapping the ocean floor with sonar is like trying to photograph a landscape by dangling a microphone from a helicopter and listening for echoes. It works, after a fashion, but the picture it produces is coarse, incomplete, and full of ambiguity. This is why the deep ocean remains the planet's last great frontier of exploration. Not because we lack interest, not because we lack technology, though the technology is still limited, but because the ocean itself resists investigation with a persistence and thoroughness that no other environment on Earth can match. The deep sea is dark, it is cold, it is pressurized, it is chemically hostile, it is geographically vast. It is difficult to reach, difficult to navigate, difficult to observe, and, as the Thresher discovered, difficult to survive. Every fact about the deep ocean is a fact about why we know so little about it. Consider the matter of human presence. As of the early 21st century, 12 human beings have walked on the surface of the moon. The number of human beings who have visited the deepest point in the ocean, the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench, can be counted on two hands. More people have left the planet entirely than have reached the bottom of the sea. The reason is not that space is easier than the ocean. In many ways, the engineering challenges are comparable, but space, for all its vacuum and radiation and distance, is at least transparent. You can see where you are going. You can communicate with ground control. You can photograph your destination from orbit before you arrive. The deep ocean offers none of these advantages. It is a world of blindness, silence, and crushing weight, and every attempt to enter it is an act of faith in the engineering that stands between you and immediate death. The Thresher's crew placed that faith in a vessel that was not worthy of it. Not because the submarine was poorly designed, in concept it was brilliant, but because the execution of that design was compromised by the same pressures that compromise every large-scale engineering project conducted under deadline and budget constraints. The faith safety gap, the distance between what the crew believed about their submarine and what was actually true about its condition, was the real killer. The crew believed they were aboard a safe vessel. The maintenance records suggested otherwise. The pipe joints were defective. The emergency blow system was vulnerable to ice. The reactor safety systems, while performing exactly as designed, had the side effect of eliminating propulsion at the moment it was most desperately needed. The crew did not know any of this. They knew their submarine was new, advanced, and backed by the full resources of the United States Navy. They trusted, and they died. This is not science fiction. This is the documented reality of what happened to 129 men in the Western Atlantic on a spring morning in 1963. And the deeper truth of their story is not about pipe joints or brazed fittings or reactor scrams. The deeper truth is about the relationship between human beings and the environment they are trying to operate in. The deep ocean is not a place that tolerates approximation. It is not a place where good enough is good enough. It is a place where every imperfection, no matter how small, is subjected to continuous, enormous, and relentless force. The ocean does not fatigue. It does not take breaks. It does not lose focus. It applies its pressure every second of every minute of every hour, and if there is a weakness, it will find it. The only question is when. The SubSafe program that emerged from the Thresher disaster represents humanity's best response to this truth. It is an acknowledgement that the ocean requires perfection, or as close to perfection as human beings can achieve. It is a system designed to eliminate the kinds of small, accumulated deficiencies that killed the Thresher's crew. And it works. Its record is remarkable, but Subseiche also represents something else, something less comforting. It represents the price of knowledge. It took 129 deaths to create Subseiche. It took the total destruction of the most advanced submarine in the American fleet to convince the Navy that its quality assurance processes were inadequate. The lesson was written in the lives of men who did not volunteer to be a lesson. They volunteered to serve their country. They volunteered to go to sea. They did not volunteer to die because someone failed to properly inspect a pipe joint. Let that sink in. The broader implications of the Thresher disaster extend far beyond submarine construction. They touch on fundamental questions about how human organizations manage risk, how they balance competing priorities, and how they respond when the consequences of failure are catastrophic and irreversible. The Navy in 1963 was not staffed by incompetent people. The engineers who designed the Thresher were brilliant. The shipyard workers who built her were skilled. The officers and sailors who crewed her were trained to the highest standards. The failure was not one of individual competence. It was a failure of systems, of culture, of the collective decisions made by an organization operating under enormous pressure to produce results. The Cold War context cannot be overstated. In 1962, the year before the Thresher's loss, the Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The Soviet submarine fleet was growing rapidly. The threat of Soviet ballistic missile submarines, lurking undetected in the ocean depths, capable of launching a devastating nuclear strike with minimal warning, was considered an existential danger to the United States. The Navy's response was to build submarines faster, deploy them sooner, and push the boundaries of depth, speed, and stealth to their limits. The Thresher was a product of that urgency. She was a weapon, designed to counter a threat that was perceived as immediate and potentially civilization-ending. In that context, the pressure to get the boat into the water, to skip inspections, to defer maintenance, to accept known deficiencies, was not irrational. It was, in the cold calculus of deterrence, a reasonable trade-off. The risk of a submarine loss was weighed against the risk of falling behind the Soviet threat. The submarine lost, but the calculus was wrong. Not because deterrence was unimportant, it was vitally important, but because the trade-off was based on a false assumption. The assumption that the risk of a submarine loss, due to construction deficiencies, was small. The Navy believed its submarines were well built. The evidence, hidden in uninspected pipe joints and untested brazed fittings, said otherwise. The organization did not know what it did not know. It was confident in its ignorance, and that confidence killed 129 men. This pattern, a confidence in incomplete knowledge, is one of the most dangerous patterns in human affairs. It appears in military operations, in corporate decision-making, in government policy, in individual choices. It is the assumption that because something has worked before, it will continue to work. That because a system has not failed, it is not going to fail. That because a risk has been assessed and accepted, the assessment was correct. The Thresher destroyed that assumption for the United States Navy. It forced the Navy to confront the limits of its own knowledge and the consequences of its own complacency. It was, in the most terrible sense, a learning experience. The ocean teaches harsh lessons. It does not grade gently. It does not offer second chances. The Thresher's crew did not get a second chance. They did not get a warning. They did not get to surface and report the problem and have it fixed and try again. They got one attempt, and the submarine they were in was not ready for that attempt, and they died. The ocean's lesson was absolute. The response, Subseiche, was proportional. Total quality assurance. Zero tolerance for deficiency. 100% traceability. The cost of the lesson was 129 lives. The cost of ignoring the lesson would have been far greater, and so the wreckage sits, still, in the dark Atlantic at 8,400 feet undisturbed. The Navy has declared the site a protected memorial. No salvage operations are permitted. No artifacts may be removed. The wreckage is to remain where it lies, in the custody of the ocean that claimed it, for as long as the ocean endures. The Thresher's crew are still there. In a sense, their remains long since dissolved into the chemistry of the deep sea. their names carved into memorials at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard and at Arlington National Cemetery. But their physical presence absorbed into the environment that killed them. They are part of the ocean floor now, part of the sediment, part of the silence. The families of the crew bore a burden that is difficult to articulate. 129 families received notification that their husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers were gone. There were no funerals in the traditional sense. There were no bodies to bury. There was no closure of the kind that comes from seeing, from touching, from the physical rituals of grief. There was only absence. A man left for sea and did not come back, and the ocean offered no explanation, no apology, no remains. The investigation provided answers of a sort, but the answers were technical, mechanical, institutional. They did not address the human cost. They could not. What does it mean to lose 120 men to the sea? Not in a battle, not in a storm, not through any act of hostility by a foreign power, but through the quiet, cumulative failure of the systems that are supposed to protect them. It means something different depending on where you stand. To the Navy, it meant a complete overhaul of submarine safety standards. To the families, it meant a lifetime of absence. To the broader public, it meant a brief period of shock, a news cycle, a memorial service, and then the slow fade of attention that accompanies all tragedies that do not directly touch one's own life. But to the ocean, it meant nothing at all. The ocean does not register loss. It does not keep accounts. It does not remember. That asymmetry between human meaning and oceanic indifference is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Thresher story. We attach enormous significance to the loss. We memorialize it. We study it. We build entire safety programs around it. We speak the names of the dead with reverence. And the ocean, the agent of their destruction, is incapable of caring. It is not cruel. Cruelty requires intent. The ocean has no intent. It has physics. It has chemistry. It has pressure, temperature, salinity, and current. It has the impersonal, mechanical operation of natural law, applied uniformly and without discrimination. The Thresher was crushed by the same forces that shaped the contours of every ocean floor on the planet. The same forces that squeeze basalt into diamond, that push tectonic plates apart and together, that drive the circulation of water from the tropics to the poles and back. The death of 129 men was, to the ocean, a non-event, a momentary disturbance in the water column, a brief addition to the sediment load, nothing more. There is a temptation, in the face of such indifference, to feel anger, to rage against the forces that destroyed those men, to blame the ocean for what it did. But the blame belongs elsewhere. It belongs with the decisions that sent a submarine to depth with defective pipe joints. It belongs with the inspection protocols that failed to catch the defects. It belongs with the culture that prioritized schedule over safety. It belongs with the institutional pressures that made good men accept unacceptable risks. The ocean did only what the ocean does. The failure was human, and that is, perhaps, the most important thing the Thresher teaches us. Not about submarines, not about the deep sea, not about pipe joints, or brazed fittings, or reactor scrams. It teaches us about ourselves, about our capacity for self-deception, about our willingness to believe that our engineering is better than it is, about our tendency to accept small risks until they accumulate into large ones, about our habit of deferring difficult decisions until the moment of reckoning arrives, and by then it is too late to decide differently. The Thresher's story is a mirror. It reflects back to us our own relationship with the environments we inhabit and the machines we build to inhabit them. We live surrounded by engineered systems, bridges, buildings, aircraft, power plants, medical devices, each one designed by human beings, built by human beings, maintained by human beings, and subject to the same pressures of cost, schedule, and competing priorities that compromise the Thresher. The question is not whether those systems have defects. They do. They all do. The question is whether we are willing to find the defects and fix them before they find us. The SubSafe program answers that question with an unconditional yes. Every defect, no matter how small, every component, no matter how minor, every document, no matter how tedious. The cost is enormous, in time, in money, in the patience of the workers who must perform the inspections and produce the documentation. But the alternative is the Thresher. The alternative is 129 men on the ocean floor. The alternative is silence. Sometimes the most profound truths emerge from the most specific tragedies. The Thresher's loss was specific, a particular submarine, a particular crew, a particular morning in April, but the truth it revealed is universal. Perfection is expensive. Imperfection, in an unforgiving environment, is fatal. There is no middle ground. There is no acceptable level of deficiency. The ocean draws a line, and on one side is survival, and on the other is annihilation. And the line is defined by the quality of every joint, every weld, every fitting, every decision made by every person involved in the construction and maintenance of the vessel. That is the legacy of the Thresher. That is what 129 men purchased with their lives. Not a lesson in submarine engineering, a lesson in the cost of compromise. The silence of the deep Atlantic, where the Thresher lies, is not truly silence. It is the sound of water in motion, of currents flowing, of sediment settling, of the slow geological processes that reshape the ocean floor over timescales that dwarf human history. But to human ears, it is silence. The silence of absence. The silence of men who were not given the chance to speak their final words, to send a last message, to say what mattered most. The UQC transmissions that the Skylark recorded were garbled, fragmented, stripped of meaning by the distortion of water and distance. The Thresher's crew died inarticulate, their voices lost in the noise of an imperfect communication system, their final moments consumed by the frantic effort to save a submarine that could not be saved. That silence persists. It will persist as long as the wreckage lies on the ocean floor, which is to say, indefinitely. The ocean is patient. It will hold the Thresher forever, in the dark, in the cold, under the crushing weight of 8,400 feet of Atlantic water. And the lesson it taught will persist with it, embedded in the SubSafe program, inscribed in the maintenance procedures and quality standards of every submarine that has been built since 1963. The dead of the Thresher protect the living of the submarine service. They do so silently, invisibly, through the changes their deaths made possible. It is not a comforting thought, but it is a true one. The ocean remembers nothing, but we must remember everything. On the 10th of April 1963, 129 men descended into the Atlantic Ocean aboard a submarine they trusted. They did not return. Their submarine was crushed by forces so immense that the word force seems inadequate. Their bodies were consumed by an environment so indifferent that the word consumed implies more intention than the ocean possesses. They simply ceased to exist, in a fraction of a second, in absolute darkness, in near-freezing water, in silence. The USS Thresher, hull number SSN 593, was the most advanced submarine of her time. She was built to dive deeper, run faster, and operate more quietly than anything else in the sea. She carried the hopes of a navy engaged in the most dangerous military competition in human history. She was a technological marvel, a weapon of deterrence, a symbol of American naval supremacy, and she was killed by a pipe joint, a tiny, imperfect junction of metal in a system of thousands, a flaw that a careful inspector might have caught, a defect that a better process would have prevented, a failure so mundane, so ordinary, so utterly lacking in drama that it is almost offensive in its banality. 129 men died because a pipe joint failed and an air system froze and a reactor shut down. Each event was small. Together, they were absolute. The men of the Thresher are still in the Atlantic. Their names are known, but their resting place is inaccessible to all but the most advanced deep-sea vehicles. They lie among the wreckage of their submarine at 8,400 feet in a debris field that stretches across the ocean floor, like the remains of a civilization that was destroyed in an instant. The sediment is slowly covering the wreckage, grain by grain, year by year, drawing a blanket of fine particles over the broken hull plates and twisted pipes and scattered fragments of a submarine that was, for a brief time, the pride of the United States Navy. In a few more decades, the wreckage will be partially buried. In a few more centuries, it will be difficult to distinguish from the surrounding seafloor. In geological time, it will disappear entirely, absorbed into the stratigraphy of the Atlantic Basin, a thin layer of anomalous metal in the sedimentary record. The ocean takes everything back, but the lessons endure. The SubSafe program, born from the Thresher's death, has protected every submarine built under its standards. Not a single SubSafe certified submarine has been lost to hull failure or flooding. That record, maintained for more than 60 years, across dozens of submarines and hundreds of thousands of dives, is a testament to what human organizations can achieve when they are sufficiently motivated by the consequences of failure. The Thresher's crew did not die in vain. They died, and their deaths forced a transformation in submarine safety that has saved untold lives. It is a bitter kind of redemption, purchased at a price that no one would have chosen to pay, but it is redemption nonetheless. The ocean is vast. It covers most of our planet. It is deeper than our mountains are tall. It is darker than our nights. It is colder than our winters. It presses on everything within it, with a force that is patient, constant, and overwhelming. It does not negotiate. It does not forgive. It does not care. It is the most indifferent force in the natural world, and it is also the most thorough. It finds every weakness. It exploits every flaw. It destroys without malice, without purpose, without awareness. It is simply the ocean, and it is enough. The men who serve in submarines today understand this. They understand it in their bones, in their training, in the procedures they follow every time they take their boats to depth. They understand it because 129 of their predecessors taught them, not through words or manuals or lectures, but through the irrevocable fact of their deaths. The Thresher's crew speaks to every submariner who has ever stood in a control room as the depth gauge ticks downward, who has ever listened to the hull creaking under pressure, who has ever felt the momentary, primal fear that every honest submariner admits to feeling when the boat goes deep. They speak in the silence between the numbers called out by the diving officer. They speak in the routine of maintenance checks and quality inspections. They speak in the SubSafe documentation that accompanies every component of every pressure-critical system in the fleet. They speak without words, but they are heard. This is the story of the USS Thresher. It is a story about the ocean, and it is a story about the people who dared to enter it. It is a story about engineering, and it is a story about the limits of engineering. It is a story about a nation at war, a Cold War, a war of technology and deterrence and brinkmanship, and it is a story about what that war cost in the quiet, uncounted currency of lives, lost not to enemy action, but to the accumulated consequences of haste. It is a story about silence, the silence of the deep, the silence of the dead, the silence that fills the space where 129 voices used to be. The Atlantic Ocean does not mourn. It does not mark the anniversary of April 10th. It does not know the names of the men it holds. It does not know that it holds them at all. It simply continues, as it has always continued, moving water from one place to another, pressing down on everything beneath its surface, covering 71% of a planet that is, in the end, defined by its water more than by its land. The Thresher is part of that water now, part of that pressure, part of that darkness, part of the ocean that took her and will keep her forever, in the deepest kind of silence there is, and somewhere 8,400 feet below the surface of the Atlantic, in the perpetual night of the deep ocean, the wreckage of the Thresher rests on the bottom, undisturbed, unreachable, unforgotten, a steel memorial to 129 men who went to sea and never came home, surrounded by the crushing, patient, indifferent weight of all the water in the world.